Here's another reading from my new book, Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right. This is from Chapter 1, which is Jung's Political Thought and Introduction. This is about the collective unconscious. Jung claims that the collective unconscious is a stratum of the unconscious that is shared by everyone, regardless of their different civilizations and cultures. As Ira Progoff points out, collective means that its contents are prior to the appearance of genuine individuality. Its origins are therefore ancient and primitive. Beyond these observations, Jung concludes that it is impossible to answer the metaphysical question of how or exactly when the collective unconscious was first expressed. All we have are symbolic expressions that came, no doubt, long after they had already bubbled up in action and non-written communication. The visible symbols by which the collective unconscious expresses itself will differ according to civilization, culture, and time, even though the archaic ground from which these symbols arise is identical in all individuals. In the concept of the collective unconscious, Jung states that the archetypes owe their existence exclusively to heredity. However, the exact mode of transmission remains unclear. Suffice it to say that Jung theorized something like a layered memory bank in the human psyche. Most of the time, only the most recent layers were accessible to our consciousness. But the symbols used in the past, even the very distant past, to express the archetypes of the collective unconscious in that age and place, were still stored in the lower levels of our unconscious, along with the archetypes themselves. For instance, Progoff writes that ancient Druid or Etruscan symbols can be found buried in the modern Irish and Italian psyche. Today, ancient symbolism is still found in dreams, myths, and even religions. If Jung's theory is correct, when the individual is a repository, then the individual is a repository of ancient history. Why do symbols change over time within cultures, even as the archetypes they express remain the same? Sometimes the change is forced by conflict, as it was during the Roman conquest of pagan Europe. Jung believed, for instance, that Europe and the United States were still dealing with the consequences of the imposition of Christianity on the pagans. Christian symbols had largely usurped the pagan symbols, but there was intermingling, and paganism lay beneath the surface, coming out in dreams. Also, symbols sometimes changed due to the slow erosion of the psychic power of life of a civilization. Such was the case with Rome in the days before the Christian conversion. Philosopher Charles Taylor's argument in A Secular Age resonates with Jung's analysis of the collective unconscious. Taylor's book is perhaps the best chronicle to date of how not only the modern scientific mentality, but certainly developments within Christianity itself, produced a disproportionate rationalism in man. This rationalism and subsequent diminishment of spiritual openness in turn destroyed the porous self. That's Taylor's term, porous self, which could have direct spiritual experiences. It created growing disenchantment or disbelief in the possibility of the supernatural or numinous experience, producing the, quote, buffered self. Along with disenchantment, Taylor writes, came a great disembedding, in which human beings lost their sense of oneness with their society and became autonomous, isolated, and atomistic. According to both Jung and Taylor, along with disenchantment and disembedding, doubt crept in as to the validity and meaning of Western society's religious rituals and symbols. They began to lose their life and force. Individuals were cut loose into a sort of painful isolation in search of new meaning and new symbols which could recapture the power of the old. We now see the aftermath of the great spiritual and psychological challenges of modernity. The collective unconscious is a powerful force that needs proper expression, and contemporary individuals still attempt to break through the modern buffered self to new experiences of identity, unity, and spirituality. Attempts in our time are often mediated by technology. Disconnected individuals feel a sense of seeking a feel of wholeness. For instance, some people in the West follow countercultural icons past and present, figures such as Terence McKenna, Duncan Trussell, Joe Rogan, and Jordan Peterson, into a syncretistic spirituality, and even the use of psychedelics as a spiritual vehicle. At the level of psychological function, these esoteric pursuits might not be that dissimilar to other attempts to connect to something larger than the individual. For instance, some Americans have followed alt-right leader Richard Spencer into the white identity movement. From a Jungian perspective, each attempt is aimed at finding some lost unity and some missing transcendent meaning. The symbolic contents of the collective unconscious are the archetypes. Archetypes are ideas or forms imprinted on the human mind by innumerable and ancient experiences. Jung sometimes links the archetypes to the Platonic forms, though it is likely that he feels he has a more concrete handle on what these ideas are than did Plato. Quote from Jung: "In former times, despite some dissenting opinion and the influence of Aristotle, it was not too difficult to understand Plato's conception of the idea as superordinate and pre-existent to all phenomenon. Archetype, far from being a modern term, was already in use before the time of St. Augustine, and was synonymous with idea in the Platonic usage." End quote. These archetypes within the collective unconscious can produce numinous or transcendent experiences. That is, they can affect us as if they are not a part of us, but something outside, some superior force. This is what Taylor would call the experience of the porous self, a self which is open to perceiving and experiencing powerful transcendent forces. The most common manifestations of this in our everyday experience would be a foul mood which descends on someone and cannot be lifted despite her and everyone else's best efforts. In earlier times, such a funk might be seen as the work of evil forces, and to this day it is experienced as something beyond our control. Plato pointed out that in ancient times there was a difference between the rational conscious will and whatever it was that produced moods, feelings, irrational prejudices, hatreds, and rage. The consciousness struggles against feelings and even ideas as if they were invading enemies. But modern psychology tends to explain this situation as the result of chemical imbalances. To be clear, Jungian archetypes are not images we observe, such as church friezes or paintings. Rather, they are instances of the, quote, inner unconscious drama of the psyche, end quote, itself. This makes them harder to grasp because, while we may be able to acknowledge similarities in the outward cultural symbols of different peoples, places, and times, and even recognize their power and importance for cultures, it seems impossible to witness firsthand the inner unconscious drama. But defending himself against the charge that the idea of archetypes were products of his imagination, Jung claimed that the idea was not really all that novel. Quote from Jung: "Mythological research calls them motifs. In the psychology of primitives, they correspond to Lévi-Bruhl's concept of collective representations, and in the field of comparative religion, they have been defined by Hubert and Mauss as categories of the imagination. Adolf Bastian long ago called them elementary or primordial thoughts. From these references, it should be clear enough that my idea of the archetype, literally a pre-existent form, does not stand alone, but is something that is recognized and named in other fields of knowledge." End quote. Jung stated that there is not a single important idea or view that does not possess historical antecedents. Symbols old and new shared the same origin in the archetypes. Jung looked to events of his own time as indicators of the continuing existence within the psyche of the older symbols. He characterized the Nazis as possessed by ancient symbols and gods. The persecution of the Jews was a revival of the medieval persecutions, and the Nazi salute revived the ancient Roman salute. A recent example of this can be seen in Richard Spencer's infamous speech in Washington, D.C. in 2016, whose rousing "Hail Trump" lines elicited Roman salutes from several in the crowd. The archaic swastika was an ancient rival of the Christian cross. These types of comparative observations may at first seem sweeping and unwarranted, even trivializing of specific historical events. What further proof does Jung have that the collective unconscious and the archetypes exist? To answer that question, we need to more deeply understand the theory which underlies Jung's claims. Jung says that in primitive societies, the archetypes are not originally thought, but are instead experienced directly as outward things. As I have suggested, this is what Taylor would call the experience of the porous self. Men encountered gods, spirits, bush souls, etc. as real beings with independent powers, and they did so collectively as socially embedded beings. These types of phenomenon are difficult, if not impossible, for modern people to imagine, even those who claim to be very religious. We are now thoroughly disenchanted and disembedded, but we see evidence in scriptures many of us profess to believe of real supernatural experiences. Gods talking to men from mountaintops, and burning bushes, and angels speaking to people. Pre-modern people would have laughed at the suggestion that these phenomena were somehow products of their imagination. It was only once people achieved a higher stage of consciousness and saw themselves as separate from others and from nature that they began to self-consciously speculate on the origins of spiritual experiences. They then entertained the idea that in some way their own psyches or their own perceptions were involved. Jung is far from being anti-individualist, as we will see, but he is quite clear that modern man, with his highly developed ego consciousness, has made a psychological mistake in taking individualization to the point of internalizing and psychologizing all spiritual phenomenon. This mistake has made it impossible for people to directly experience the spiritual world as their ancestors did. However, in the interim, before the excessive ego consciousness that arose from modernity, man began to experience, contemplate, and relate to the archetypes using symbols depicted in paintings and sculptures, acted out in rituals, and handed down in stories. This way of relating to the contents of the collective unconscious was necessary for the growth of consciousness and individuality. The rich store of symbolism that mankind built up in his relationship with the archetypal contents of the objective psyche is now our conduit to an approximation of the direct or porous experience. This is why Jung was so heavily involved in the cross-cultural and trans-historical study of symbols, and why Joseph Campbell and now Jordan Peterson have been able to popularize these studies for future generations. Even though the symbols themselves are not the archetypes, the study of symbols is the primary means, not reliant on direct personal experience, of proving the existence and importance of the collective unconscious. It is Jung's impressive treatment of the similarities among myths, religions, and dreams across time and within and across cultures that lends his concepts of the collective unconscious and the archetypes as much empirical weight as can be had in such matters. I think that's a good place to stop. So if you like this section, there's a whole chapter of which this is near the beginning that explains these fundamental concepts of Jung's theory in as clear a language as I could muster. Hope you like this, and I will leave notes to where you can buy the book if you'd be interested in doing so below. Bye.